Perceptions today. It's UK date 15th of December 2022, and we happen to have our esteemed guest Anthony Peake for a live meet and greet. This is session 2, 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Please remember that the Twitter space records the events for 30 days. We will be recording independently for Perceptions Today podcast and Anthony Peake's YouTube channel, which if you go to YouTube and type in the top one word, Anthony Peake with the number 1, you will find all his videos and interviews that are there. Please remember, only talk about what you feel comfortable being recorded and played again. If you've never been to Perceptions Today, we deal with consciousness research in all areas, along with pain management. I am your host, Paul, and today your co-host is our special guest, RN Voot, birthday boy himself. Would you like to say hello?
Thanks for reminding everyone how old I'm getting. Really appreciate that.
Everybody send him tweets on RN Voot and Twitter, please. Happy birthday, hashtag happy birthday. So, along with this, you will find his books mentioned within his bio as well. We've got some live events coming up, and I shall do this in reverse order in honor of our guest who is here. On March the 1st, 2022, RN Voot will be talking about his books on Spirit in the Sky, Brain Structures, and also DMT and Mythology. Then on January the 13th, going backwards, we have Eileen Myers talking about Kundalini energy and her life. Then on January the 6th, which will be the first live Twitter Space event of the year, Stephanie Quick and Synchronicity. So now, if you've not been here before, I'm going to go over the guidelines that we tend to use without dropping my list of papers. Our favourite one is just be civil to everyone and keep on topic. If you want to speak within the Twitter space, always use a smartphone or a tablet with the app installed. Always best using headphones which are charged or wired in or Bluetooth. Again, fully charged. When it comes down to announcements, whether it be technical issues or questions from the DMs, or even if it's at times just to bring people back on track, or let people know who's in the space who are good researchers and other people should know, I shall be using possibly the mute button or just interrupting as normal. If there's any problems, just contact myself, Perceptions Today, and DM me, and myself and the co-host will sort the things out. If you've never been here before, on the bottom part of your screen in the Twitter app, you'll find there's a set of icons. The best icon to look for is the heart one, which gives us more access. When you press that, you'll find the peace sign. The way that we use it within this Twitter space is that you cannot talk at present, so that makes it easy. Hands up is I want to talk, or the fist sign is agreement, 100% strongly agree. Laughing face is just when things go wrong. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, sometimes Twitter spaces crash. It would be best to follow myself, Perceptions Today, because if it does crash, I can tweet out the next link and you can follow us back again. And after that, if you don't like the conversations you heard, you can always unfollow, which will not be a problem. When you speak for the first time, if you want, you can give a 30-second introduction of yourself and a brief question and answer with the information. If you like the content being discussed, you could comment in Perceptions Today Twitter account or subscribe to the podcast. If you want to be involved in more, then just follow any people that are in the account. What we also would like you to do is, when you do introduce yourself, if you want to make life interesting for us, mention your Twitter handle so that's recorded and we know where the question comes from. If you want, you can use your forename. You could also say where in the world you are, and also which media platforms that you see Anthony Peake's work on, whether it be Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, which gives us a good idea of where people are consuming his research from. Then if you want a brief question put to him, and then obviously an answer, or just saying hi, that's great. If you want to send direct tweets to him, please use Perceptions Today community hashtag and hashtag cheating the ferryman. And if we use those tweets, hashtags, we can get a good following because he's bringing out his next book in 2022 and it will work really well. Now, if you're looking at the agenda says introductions, and we've gone through introductions. We've gone through the guidelines, and we will be introducing Anthony Peake, which will be good. As you know, his work deals with consciousness research, and he's written 11 books. 12th one is on the way, as I said, in June 2022. He's published over 110,000 copies of his books, one in every major language. He's done many a podcast around the world, as well as actually speaking around the world as well. So I would like to introduce to you Anthony Peake. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to a second session where we'll be getting into the deep and the meaningful. Always wonderful to link with you guys, and it's very important. Just ask the questions that you really want to ask me. I really don't mind if it's off topic. Once it's not too off topic, I'm more than happy to discuss it because I'm interested in most things. But if it is related to my work, all the better. So really looking forward to this session. I'm talking to you now from a very, very grey and miserable West Sussex afternoon. But then again, it is mid-December, and that's what we expect, really.
So if you want to bring up your hands, you need to request it first before you can put a question forward. So please step up to the plate and ask for a request, and then we will supply that, and we can go from there. Meanwhile, Rich is just fumbling around with the speaker, just checking out to see if it works. Do you have any questions at the moment, Richard? Greybeard, nice to see you. Hopefully all the audio is working. Trent, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Would you like the floor first?
I would love to ask a question. I know I've read some where Anthony has brought up the egregor. And I've personally, done a little reading, Mark Stavish's work, a few other places. But I'm just curious if that's something that, Anthony, if you see that as like only capable of bad, can there be a good egregor? Can we build something that's something positive, or is that always something that we're subconsciously plugging into?
An excellent question. And funnily enough, one of the people I messaged earlier on today that this was taking place was the great Mark Stavish as well. So hopefully if he picks up the message, he may join us a bit later on, which would be really excellent if he could. I'm a huge admirer of Mark's work. It was highly influential upon myself. And his book on egregores, I strongly advise anybody to read if they're interested in the concept. Now, my idea of an egregor is probably slightly broader than the esoteric traditions say. For me, an egregor is both, and as Mark Stavish says in his book, an egregor is more than just an entity that is created by the anticipation of the human mind. It's a group creation. So when a group of people get together, they create an egregorial presence. It's almost the concept of the third man, the idea that there is something greater than the group when a group of people get together. For instance, now we are all creating an egregor from our joining our minds together in a collective way. Now, I'm a trained sociologist, and one of my degrees was in sociology, and the idea of crowds has always intrigued me, and also the way in which groupthink seems to work as well. So in terms of whether it can be positive or negative is an interesting point, because I would argue that whatever the group anticipates wants to take place can in some way take place. For example, for many years, I've been quite intrigued as to how it is that people who have what can be considered non-standard beliefs, when they group together, everything seems to reinforce that belief system. For instance, Jehovah's Witnesses, as an example, as a religious sect, they reinforce their own beliefs with each other. And I would argue that their world almost molds around them to create the anticipations of their beliefs. And I've noticed this a few times. And I'll give an example. And I discussed this. I started discussing this in my new book, but I decided that there was so much more in this that I would probably hold it back for a future book. But I'm interested in the idea of the way in which scientists anticipate subatomic particles. the way in which they will think that there should be a subatomic particle here. And on many times, it's not even theoretical. It's just a hunch or a feeling. And this has happened through physics throughout history. There seems to be a belief system, a scientific paradigm that is in force for many, many years. And then suddenly that whole paradigm falls apart. Now, again, I think it was in 1970 or the late 1960s, a guy called, it was the theory of scientific revolutions. I think it was Kern. And the idea was that scientific revolutions are almost brought about by the anticipations of humanity. We suddenly notice there are things that don't quite make sense within our science. And scientists then go away and do experiments and prove, lo and behold, that what seemed to be a sensible science all falls apart. For example,
you were right. It is Thomas Kuhn, Kuhn. Yeah,
Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn. Thank you. And with Kuhn's idea, for instance, he uses the argument of the way in which the Aristotelian worldview, which was the worldview of the medieval schoolmen, managed to explain everything. And they used Aristotelian science from the ancient Greeks to explain everything from movement to the cycles of the planets. But they had a slight problem because it was very geocentric. So they believed that planet Earth was the center of the universe and that everything revolved around it. And of course, that made sense to them because the Earth was steady, didn't move, and seemed logical that everything else moved around the Earth. Now, the problem was that the outer planets move differently. They will move across the sky in an orderly fashion in one direction, then suddenly they'll turn back on themselves. And this retrograde motion was a great puzzle to them. So they came up with things they called epicycles, which were mathematical structures to explain this, and they were happy with this. Until Copernicus came along and pointed out that if you made the sun the center of the solar system, suddenly you didn't need epicycles anymore. And suddenly the science changed. But it seemed as if, we suddenly thought this thing, and suddenly the universe changed itself to accommodate this. Now we carry forward into the modern era of science. And for example, in December of 1900, a 42-year-old physicist called Max Planck stood up in Berlin giving a talk on physics. Now, he had been employed by the German government to find ways of making lights more efficient, light bulbs, because Germany felt they were falling behind the USA and the UK in terms of this technology. And he had an issue with something called black body radiation, which I won't go into, but it was called the electromagnetic catastrophe, and it was a real problem with science at that time. And he really couldn't figure a way around this problem. And then he turned around and he said, in a literal act of desperation, he just thought up a number and started plugging it into the figures. And also quite madly turned around and thought to himself, if energy wasn't continuous, if it came in little packages or quanta, I could explain black body radiation and the electromagnetic catastrophe, or the infrared catastrophe, I should say. And it worked. And it worked completely. And it explained in totality everything. And one of the mathematical structures he came up with is called the Planck constant, which was just a number he came up with in his act of desperation. We now know that his act of desperation created the whole quantum world. The whole way the world is understood to be was through his act of desperation. Not only that, but the Planck constant occurs throughout science, throughout cosmology. It's irregular within quantum mechanics. It is extraordinary that this took place. But we roll forward and we suddenly find, because quantum physics was so strange, all kinds of weird and wonderful ideas suddenly started coming out from the woodwork. The idea that waves and particles have duality, that there is an issue with waves themselves and whether they are statistical waves or not. But then it became the particles themselves. Somebody would think, we need a particle here. And they'd find it. And this was extraordinary. It happened time and time and time again. And I'll give one incredible example when they were looking for the muon. They knew that they thought that there should be a particle here somewhere. And they found the muon. And the guy who was the head of the laboratory, a guy called E. Rabi, turned round and said, "Who ordered that?" As if somebody had gone out and just ordered a pizza and it just appeared. So it seems to be that there's a direct relationship between the anticipation of a scientist and the discovery of a subatomic particle. It's now known as the particle zoo because there's so many of them. Every time they think of one, it pops into existence. Now,
that's very similar with Rupert Sheldrake as well, was talking about crystals and how they were thought to be transferred in scientists' beards from one country to another and forming in other laboratories. There's always a fantastic story he tells, but it's the same kind of thing, that you bring it into existence by thinking about it.
Well, this is where it comes down to then the central part of particle physics and quantum physics is the role of the observer within the experimentation and within the subatomic particles themselves. Because we know from something called wave-particle duality and the observer effect that subatomic particles, until they are observed or measured, are literally a statistical wave. They do not exist. But the moment that they are measured or anticipated to be in a location somewhere, suddenly they appear. This means that there's a direct relationship between consciousness and external reality, because, of course, external reality is just made up of aggregates of countless numbers of subatomic particles. And the subatomic particles that have this strange wave-particle duality are now large. Well, I'm talking about really big particles. There's a guy called Anton Zeilinger at the University of Vienna, and the largest particles he's been working with, I think, are even larger now than buckyballs. The largest one I'd heard was a buckyball, which has 60 separate atoms in it. And if a buckyball is not observed, it's a wave. And when it is
you
observed,
might want to explain what a buckyball is to people who've not actually heard one or seen one.
Okay, it's the jokey term for something called Buckminster fullerene, which is just a very, like a soccer ball looks like. It's a bit like that. It's a circuit. It's a big spherical collection of molecules that are linked together, atoms linked together to make a very, very large molecule. Now, what they've discovered is that even larger particles than that have been found to be directly related to whether they are observed or not. Now, in my latest book, I do a calculation. And the latest discoveries are that these things, and get this, are 40% the size of a virus. Now, this has extraordinary implications because they still do not know what the biggest size is where quantum weirdness ends and physical reality starts and our consensual Einsteinian universe, not even Einsteinian really, probably Newtonian, where everything seems to work. So yes, there is a direct relationship between the anticipation of something and it coming into existence. And of course, egregors can be good or can be bad. It depends on what you're trying to create. Although it does seem from the evidence from mystical traditions that when you create these things, they do tend to become more and more malevolent as time goes on. For example, the famous case of the Belgian traveller, I can't think of her name now, her name's just gone blank, but Alexander Neil. And she and a group of her friends in Tibet in the 1920s created a tulpa. And a tulpa is a thought form. And this thought form, they made it into a happy, laughing monk. And it followed them round as they were traveling round the Tibetan plateau. But it became more and more malevolent, became more and more evil. And in the end, they had to, by concentrated thought, destroy it in one way or another. Now, I will then finally make the point, because earlier on this morning I was mentioning this as well. There's a fascinating case that took place in 1970 in Canada, in Toronto, where a group of researchers created completely somebody who was totally mythical. They created a ghost, and they called it Philip Aylesford, and they gave it a background and a history, all of which was fictional. They made it all up, but this being manifested itself. Not only did it manifest itself, it actually became like a poltergeist. Not only that, but it was able to levitate tables, and it levitated tables live on Canadian television in the early 1970s. But it wasn't real. It only existed because people anticipated it. And this is very, very intriguing.
Feeding a battery. I've got a question from Krista DeMeo, who I will pose it to you, but I'd just like to say hello, Paranormal Blip. Again, a good paranormal podcast to go and listen to. If you look into his bio, it looks up all about UAPs and other phenomena. And his family has written books before on reincarnation and other experiences when they've been talked about. Again, you have Mike Rito, an author worthwhile looking into, a friend of Anthony Peake's, as I'll go through. And again, R.N. Voot, who is obviously a very good author. And I saw somebody else who's just run away, which is not good. I shall get them. Oh, there you are, Trent. He has Continuing the Conversation podcast. And these people, if you do go to the Perceptions Today podcast and look from a drop to an ocean, you'll hear them talk about themselves and do it in a very small manner, but explain what they're all up to, and it's worthwhile following them and listening to them. So the question from the audience, and hopefully I will read it correctly. My teeth are not in. So Krista DeMayo says, what relationship does lucid dreaming in relation to connecting with the daemon? And when we're spelling that for the people who are listening later on, it's Daemon, not Demon, because that can get confusing when we've had conversations with people who listen in later again.
Yeah, particularly because the word daemon was literally demonized or demonized, while dropping the A or the I, depending on the spelling, because of course if it's original Greek, it's the sound rather than the letters, which is important. An interesting question. Just for the guys out there, and I'm sure that most of you know what lucid dreaming is about. And again, somebody I've contacted over this podcast, and then if he gets the chance, if he drops in, is a guy called Robert Wagner, who is one of the world's leading authorities on lucid dreaming, far greater expert on the subject than I am. But lucid dreaming is, in fact, when you are dreaming, you become aware of the fact that you are dreaming, and you become aware of the fact of who you are, and your ego appears again. Because normally when we're in dream states, we seem to be extremely stupid. We seem to believe everything we see, but we don't really have a concept of selfhood in quite the same way. We just are an observer. But when you become lucid within a dream, you can then manipulate the dream around you in one way or another. Now, I've only been lucid once in a lucid dream state, and it was quite extraordinary. Probably one of the most extraordinary events of my life, where you realize you can fly. And you realize you can do all kinds of extraordinary things. But what is intriguing is the identity of other people.
Hang on one second. Now I've got to check because I can't hear Anthony. Can somebody else come off mic mute?
I lost them as well.
Yeah, Anthony, yeah, and talking to